Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Sean couldn't make it again today because he's stuck at work, but we have returning guest Mikey. And if you remember Mikey was the guy who did the V8 swap. He did the 2UZ motor out of Toyota Sequoia and plopped it into his third gen 4Runner. He's here to help me out because he's good with electrical and I'm not so good with electrical. And what we're going to do today is we're going to put in an aftermarket transmission temperature gauge on my 98 4Runner. The reason why I'm doing that is you can't get transmission temperature information from your ECU because the years 96 through 98 don't offer it via the OBDII port that you're pulling information from the computer. The only thing that's available for the 96 to 98 is the idiot light, where if your transmission temperature hits right around 300 degrees, it lights up on your dashboard and says, "Hey idiot, stop, because you're gonna burn up your transmission." I really like monitoring my transmission temperatures. I also have a 2000 4Runner and I'm able to monitor my transmission temperatures straight from the OBDII reader that I use, the Bluetooth reader, sending information to my Android phone with the Torque Pro app. And I want to be able to monitor transmission temperatures on my 98 also because I think it's really important to monitor the transmission temperature, especially if you go up into the mountains or you tow and you start to see that temperature spike for whatever reason. Maybe you actually have a dramatic leak and your transmission's getting ready to overheat and you see that temperature rising, you know something's off. Or like I said earlier, you're climbing mountains, loaded down with gear, or you're towing something, you see that temperature start to go up. Maybe it's time to pull over and give your transmission a break, because as the temperature of the fluid goes up, the life of the fluid goes down. And you basically don't want to burn up your fluid to where it's not going to be lubricating your transmission properly. That's why I think it's important to monitor the transmission temperatures and why I want to add an aftermarket temperature gauge so I can monitor it on this 98 4Runner. So let me show you the parts that I bought for this job. The gauge I bought is made by Maxtow. I bought it straight from Amazon. Some people like using the autometer gauges. I chose this one because it has finer increments along the dial and it also offers a digital readout too. And that's why I chose this Maxtow gauge over an autometer gauge. The next thing I bought is I bought a gauge pod, and you have different options to where you want to install your aftermarket gauge. I'm going to choose to put it on the A-pillar. Here's what the A-pillar pod looks like, and it just fits up onto your A-pillar like so you can read the gauge in a good place where it's in your field of vision. You don't have to look down. Some people put the gauge near the shifters, but that means you're going to have to look down to see the gauge. With this on the A-pillar, it's basically in your field of view as you're driving down the road. This pod comes black in color, so you have to find a color that matches your interior trim well. The color that I'm using is from SEM. There's the number right there. It's a 15893. I'll put a link to this color in the video description along with a link to all the other parts I bought for this job. And this guy on toyota4runner.org is the one who turned me on to this color. He said it would be a good match for my interior trim, and it ends up being a pretty close match. You have to tap into your transmission line somewhere. I'm going to tap into the send line that sends the hot transmission fluid to the transmission cooler in the bottom of the radiator. The first thing I bought to tap into the line is a 1/4 inch brass fitting. In order to connect to the hose on either side of that fitting, you need some hose barbs. So these are 3/8 inch hose barbs. So I got 2 of them here. On the bottom of the T, you have to have a bushing that goes from 1/4 inch to 1/8 inch. So this is a bushing that's going to go at the bottom of the T so I can insert the actual temperature sensor into the T. You're going to need some hose clamps. So these are just a hose clamp that will work for anywhere from 5/16 to 5/8 inch application. And then I'm going to use some Teflon paste to make all those connections on this fitting leak free. That's everything that I bought for this job to make it happen. We're going to tackle one of the harder things, and that's actually getting this A-pillar grab handle off of the A-pillar post. Toyota decided to use a factory Loctite on these screws, thinking that maybe no one is ever going to want to take it off. and they wanted to make sure that this thing won't come loose. Get a little screwdriver in there and pull the hatch off. And I'll do the same with the bottom one. So now you have these little hatches that hide the screws out of your way. If you try to get these off with just hand strength and a Phillips screwdriver, you're not going to be able to do it. The way to get these free is use an impact screwdriver. We show this technique in the video we did for removing the headliner on my buddy Mark's truck. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the impact driver, we're going to actually hit it to where it's tightening the screw a little bit to sort of break free the Loctite, and then we're going to transition to loosening and hit it until this thing is loose enough to take it out with a screwdriver. So I'm selecting one of my impact Phillips heads that's going to fit pretty good. My first choice was better. Okay, so this is my impact screwdriver that I bought via Amazon. I'll put a link to it if you want to buy the same one. You put the Phillips end into the tool, and then you make sure that it's set up to tighten first. So the way these impact screwdrivers work is if you push it in and turn it to the right, that means it's going to be tightening. If I push it in and turn it to the left, that's going to be loosening. So I'm going to push it in and have it to the right, so it's going to be first tightening. You fit it on the screw, get your hammer of choice. I'm going to give it a couple whacks to tighten it first. Now I'm going to go to loosen it. Turn it, push it in, turn it to the left. The way this impact screwdriver works is when you hit it, it turns the head of the tool just a little bit each time. So every time I strike it, the head of the tool is doing a very small incremental turn to the left to loosen it. Okay. It's finally loose enough now that I could turn it out without having to strike it anymore. Taking a close look at it, you see the blue on the threads. That's the factory Loctite, and that's what you're trying to break free by using the impact screwdriver. So now I got to get the bottom one. Now, because the length of the tool, we did the same thing on Mark's truck. We actually hit it through the steering wheel. So let me see if I can adjust the steering wheel a little bit, maybe make it a little bit better, so I could strike it easier. So again, I'm going to start by hitting it to tighten it. Okay, I think I got it loose enough. And just like that, the sucker's off. Now we're going to mark where we want this gauge pod onto the A-pillar. So I'm going to fit it underneath here. It's going to have to go below where the grab rail goes. And then I really don't want it like rubbing up against the dashboard. So somewhere in the middle, I think that's probably good right there. So I'm going to scribe a mark with a pencil. The reason why I want to scribe a mark with a pencil is because we're going to take this A-pillar piece of trim off, and to affix this pod to the A-pillar trim piece, we're going to drill holes in all four corners and use the supplied plugs to attach it. So this will give me a reference of where it needs to be when I drill the holes to attach it. For removing interior trim pieces, this is a nice little kit. It's a trim removal tool set that I bought via Amazon. I'll put a link in the video description if you'd like to buy the exact one. And so it's got all different shapes and sizes. So I'm going to choose maybe this little jobber. This is the B pillars. This A-pillar trim piece fits behind the B-pillar trim, so I'm going to pry this up a little bit first. So you just need to pull it, the B-pillar trim piece, out of the way so you can get the A-pillar trim that sits behind it free. Now I'm going to work along the top here and pry everywhere. You can see with the holes where it actually pops in. I'm going to pry over here and just pull it out all the way. So now that I got it all the way free, now we're just going to take this out of the vehicle and drill the holes we need to drill. The directions that come with the 8-pillar pod says you need to drill 3/16" holes through this and through the actual 8-pillar trim piece in order to put these plugs in that hold the pod to the 8-pillar trim piece. I'm going to start off with a smaller drill bit as a pilot hole, and then I'm going to move up to the 3/16" drill bit. Now, as for where we want to actually drill the holes, this trim piece fits over the metal A-pillar, and we notice that there's a rib here that gives you a little room so these plugs can actually stick out through the back a little bit. So we're gonna drill a little bit more towards the center than to the very far ends, so there's room for that plug to sink in all the way. Using the line I drew when I was in the vehicle, I'm gonna set the pod on top of the 8-pillar trim piece, and then I'm gonna drill my pilot holes. I'm doing this on a piece of wood, so as the drill bit goes through, I'm not going to go into the concrete. Just good practice so you're not going to mess up your drill bits. I'm going to drill one on the bottom here. And then the final one over here. Now that I got some pilot holes, I'm going to graduate up to the 3/16. You want to hold this thing firm so it doesn't walk on you. Now that I got one hole started, I'm going to put the first plug in. And that's going to basically be a nice placeholder, so the pod is going to be less likely to move as I drill the other holes. So now I'm going to drill one of the ones in the back. Same thing, I'm going to put a plug in now that I got one on the opposite side in. Now I'm going to drill the other two. And we'll drill the final one. And that's all there is to it. There's two sets of wires that are going to be going to this trans temp gauge. One set of wires is to power it. The other set of wires is actually send the transmission temperature from the sensor that I'm going to put into the line. You have to drill through this 8-pillar trim piece, so when you put the gauge in there, you can plug in the wires. It looks like a 1/2" drill bit is just going to be big enough to fit this biggest connector through the back. You could have drilled this hole first or afterwards. I just got to be careful with this drill bit and don't go into the pod. We're choosing to go right above this rib, which is going to put it right in this area right here. Let's just see if this will fit through. Yep, this connector will fit through. So this is going to be big enough for both wires to fit through the back. This color we got is sort of close, but not really close. And if you're super anal, you're probably not going to be happy because you'll notice it, maybe. But anybody that gets in your truck is probably not going to notice. So I just touched it up on the edges and purposely got a little bit of paint onto the 8-pillar trim piece to sort of kind of blend it in. Nobody's really going to notice this. You can see the hole that we drilled through the back there. Before we start messing with disconnecting electrical connectors inside the vehicle, we're going to disconnect power to the system by removing the negative battery terminal. It's a 10mm, so I'm just using an open-end wrench, loosening it up, twist it, and just push it down out of your way so it can't make a connection. Now there's no power to the vehicle. For the power for this gauge, the instructions for the max toe gauge says you have to tap into a 12-volt constant wire, a 12-volt switched wire. you have to hook into a line that will dim with the headlights, so an illumination wire, and then you have to hook to a ground. We read that a good set of wires to tap into is the wiring that goes to the car stereo. So to get this trim piece off, we're going to start from the armrest. The reason why we're starting from here and going to work our way forward to remove this trim piece around the parking brake, the trim piece around the shifters, and then finally here is because in succession this trim piece around the parking brake lever fits over the top of the shifter one, and the shifter one fits over the face plate that goes around your heater controls and your stereo. So that's why we're gonna remove the back one first on the parking brake and work our way forward. Utilizing the trim toolkit, I'm just gonna get underneath here in between the armrest and the trim piece, and I'm gonna pull forward, and you're breaking free clips. Now with these 96 through 98 vehicles, they have switches on this panel. So you have to be careful when you're pulling this forward. You're not pulling too hard right away. You got to get the wires disconnected too. So now that this is up a little bit, the power for the back window is just a squeeze tab. You squeeze the connector and you pull back and you can get it out. So that one's free. This one on this side for the ECT button, same thing. You have a connector. There's a push tab on the side facing the passenger seat. You push that in and pull back. Now that one's disconnected. You can pull out this top one and it's a little speaker. The other one is the actual light bulb, and it's got a couple little clips that you gotta release. There's one on the top and then one on the bottom. So now you can see the little light bulb and the little speaker disconnected. Now I can pull this thing up and out of the way. The next trim piece we're going to get out of the way is the one around the shifters. Depending on whether you have a SR5 model or you have a limited model, if you have an SR5 model, you don't have the push button four-wheel drive button here. So all you have to do is spin it lefty loosely counterclockwise, and you could spin the top of the transfer case shifter off of the shifter. If you have a limited model like I do, you have the switch and you have to remove a screw. Japanese automobiles, they use a screw that looks like a Phillips, but it's actually a JIS, a Japanese industry standard. So I'm using this screwdriver made by Vessel, and it's a JIS screwdriver. So a JIS screwdriver fits the heads of these screws a little bit better, and you have a less chance of stripping them. So that's what I'm going to use. I've already taken this screw out before because I was tracking down a noise behind this, and Toyota used a Loctite on this screw also. So if you're taking this off for the first time on your limited model, you're going to find that that screw comes out a little bit rough. They put a lot of Loctite on there. So just be prepared that it's going to come out rough almost the whole way. So I'm going to screw this out. There's a lot of blue Loctite on the threads of this screw. Now you can see that this thing will pull up. So that's why you're removing that screw. Now you could just get your hands underneath here and pull up. And you have to disconnect the electrical connector for that switch for the four-wheel drive, and it's right here. I found that this electrical connector is a little bit of a pain in the butt to release, but hopefully I'm going to get it. We got the connector apart. There's just a little clip right here that hooks right behind here. Pry from the front or pry from the back. I actually got the screwdriver in here and twisted it up, and then Mikey pulled back at the same time because this sucker just fights me every time. So don't be surprised if this little connector for the four-wheel drive system gives you a pain. So now it's disconnected. Now we could pull this piece up and out of the way. If you have a faceplate to your stereo, you can get the stereo out of the way. Get any other accessory things that you have plugged in out of the way. You can pull these dials off. So you want to pull off the controls for your heater. They just pull off. They're just a friction fit. These same, they just pull off. These little ends pull off. You would think now that it's just like all the other trim pieces. You just start pulling and the thing comes off. But what you don't know is there's some Phillips head screws right behind this faceplate. And I found this off the hard way, tracking down that annoying noise that was behind here. And I started pulling on it. It's like, man, this thing is really fighting me. And then I finally pulled this little trim piece off and saw that there's screws behind there. So I could pull this off. Now this AC switch, it's kind of a unique thing. You don't actually have to disconnect any plug. It just plugs in here like this. So it's fine that if it came out with the base plate. So I'll just slide that back in there like that. There's two screws that you have to release that hold this trim piece onto the controls for the heater. There's one in the bottom right, and then there's one in the top left. So using the same JIS screwdriver, I'm going to disconnect these. Now that those two screws are out of the way, now I can start prying this up. Now you're going to have other electrical connectors. You got one for your hazard light and you got one for your defrost that you have to disconnect. You're also going to have one for your clock. I'm going to take these first two top ones out and just a push on the connector and pull it back. There's one. There's two. I got the one out for the clock. It's on the side over here. The push button is towards this direction. So you have to push this one in to get it out. You have a connector for your cigarette lighter. Just pull this back. That plug. You got the light for the cigarette lighter. That has also a little push button clip on the side that faces the middle. Those two are disconnected. And now you have a little light bulb for the ashtray. The light bulb for the ashtray is like a friction fit. So I just got on it with a pair of needle nose pliers and pried backwards, and I was able to get the light bulb out of there. That should be everything. And you got this whole sucker disconnected. Now we're going to pull the stereo out because we want to access the stereo wires for this project. They're 8mm bolts. You could also use a Phillips head screwdriver if you want. I'm going to choose to use my Milwaukee cordless M12 tool to zip these out. So now we can pull the stereo out. I'm going to disconnect the antenna wire. It should just be a friction fit pull back. There's the antenna jack. And then there's the electrical connector here. There's a little push tab on the top. You push it down and then you could pull back on the plug. Now that connector for the stereo is free. This stereo has a microphone, so you have to unplug this also. Now the whole stereo unit is free of the vehicle. The wiring for the temperature sending unit is going to leave the T that I'm going to cut into the send line for the transmission cooler, and it's going to run up into the engine bay, and then we have to figure out how we're going to get it through the firewall. Now, some people don't even choose to go through the firewall. They actually, I saw one guy on Toyota400.org, he just made a little pinhole on the transfer case shifter boot, and he ran the wire through there. I'm choosing to do it through the firewall, and a common place that people choose to run wires into the firewall is one of the established grommets. And the main established grommet that people usually try to run wires through is on the driver's side firewall, and I'll show you where it's at. So it's this main grommet right up against the fender well, and a lot of people run wiring for accessory wiring through there. The problem with this location is it's prone to leak water after you mess with it, and here's the reason. You see this area right here, this is kind of a natural gutter for water to come down your windshield and come down here, and it's going to drop off right at this point. And right below that point, guess what? You got the grommet right below there, and this is why water tends to get through if you compromise that grommet, pushing more wires through. It's because the water basically travels right down on top of it on a constant basis every time you wash your rig or you're in rainy conditions. We noticed there's another grommet here. It's towards the center. It's still more towards the driver's side. It's right here behind the plenums, close to the driver's side valve cover. Right here is one of the fuel lines. So it's right behind the fuel line. Right above it and a little bit more towards the middle is the throttle cable. So this is the plug that we're going to use to get through the firewall to run the wires. And I'm also in the future going to be running some accessory wiring for lighting. So I'm going to be using this as the pathway for future wiring too. So to get this plug out, you just got to get a screwdriver in there, and it's going to be brittle and it's most likely going to break on you, but you just got to pry it out. It's kind of fighting me, so I'm grabbing hold of it with a needle nose pliers, and I pulled it out. Right behind the plug, you're going to see a bunch of insulation, and then on the inside, right past the insulation, there's like a rubbery kind of plastic sheath that covers all the insulation. What you want to do is you want to grab like a sharp tool, go right in the center, and push through that plastic or rubber sheath so you get an idea exactly where the center of the hole is. So we're using just a tiny little fine tip kind of punch, and Mikey's gonna push it through the hole, and I'm gonna be underneath the dash showing you where it's coming through. There you go, you're right through. Now that we have an idea of where the hole is, I'm gonna take a utility blade and make a small X so we can push wires through that rubberized sheath. The hole's right here, so I'm just going to make a little X with the utility blade. You can see that the rubber sheath against the firewall has got an X in it to where we can push the wires through now. The plug we pulled out is not going to really work as a good grommet, and so what I bought for this via Amazon is there's a universal 1 1/4 inch firewall boot. And so I'll open it up and I'll show you what it looks like. So depending on how many wires you have to run through, this is the smallest diameter. It's a 3/8 inch. If you cut it to this next line right here, then that's 11/16. If you cut it all the way back to this, you could run up to 1 inch diameter bundle of wires. Well, for right now, we're just gonna keep this at the 3/8 because I'm only running like a small amount of wires. And then if I need more room for wiring in the future, I could always just slit this with an X-Acto blade or a utility blade, open it up bigger to run more wires through. So here's the wiring that's going to go to the sending unit. This end right here, the 2 prongs, that connects up to the sending unit, and then this end connects up to the back of the gauge. I'm going to go through this universal boot with the end and give myself a little room to work. We already got a hole pushed through the insulation, so I'm going to try to feed this through and push it through the other side. Now we got to get this grommet fit into the firewall. Pretty pliable, so I'm going to try to just fold it and manipulate it into the hole there. Maybe easier said than done. The way I went about it, by folding it and then fitting in there, it works, but it takes some patience, and it's kind of tight to get your hand and your arm in there. You have to fit it in and then get it in the right spot on the seam that it fits against, and then a little bit of more folding and twisting the boot to where it finally seats and it's not like crinkled or crumpled up. If you look back here now, it looks like it's properly installed. There's no folds in the rubber anymore, and it's firmly in there.
So we're going to do some cable sheathing on this, and what I found after doing so much of this on my own truck is that there's a tool that's actually made to help out. I got this from Dell City. It's dellcity.net, and this is the part number. It's a 909-900, and it's just a nice cheap little tool to help do this cable sheathing. So basically the idea is that you're going to run your cables in through here, and I'll show you. We're going to take this cable and we're going to run it in this way, and then you twist this to lock it in, and then you take this and you start pulling it through. Once you get good at this, you can go quite quickly, but for me, I mean, I don't use it that often, so I just try and pull it a little slowly, and you just slowly pull it through.
In order to make it easier for us to run the wires and to actually film and show you what we're doing, we're going to remove this panel underneath the steering column. We're first going to disconnect the 2 cables for the gas filler hatch and the hood release, and there's 2 Phillips head screws on each one that you have to loosen. So you can see there's 2 Phillips head screws there for the filler hatch and 2 Phillips head screws there for the hood release. So I'm just going to loosen those and then push them out the back to get them out of the way. So the hood release one is done. Now I'm working on the gas filler hatch one. Okay, those 2 are loose. There's 4 10mm bolts we have to take off. There's one here right near the ignition. There's one below down here. And then same thing on the opposite side. One high and one low in the corner here near the fuse box. I'm just going to zip these out with my M12 Milwaukee. And this should just pull out like so. So right now the wire is going through the firewall and it's going right below this big wiring bundle right here, and then traveling through towards this wiring bundle that goes below the steering column. The wiring goes behind here, the wire's right here, and then you'll see daylight. When you look above, heading towards the A-pillar, you'll be able to see daylight, and that's where the wire is going to travel right up through this space right here and to the A-pillar pod with your gauge. This is the wire for the power to the gauge. So it's got the 4 ends right here. So I'm going to stick the 4 ends down through the same pathway. Maybe twist them just a little bit so they don't get hung up. Mikey has run a lot of wiring in his truck, and he said that if we take this vent tube out, which looks like it's just 1 Phillips screw, we can get better access to zip tie. So I'm going to take this thing out to make it even easier to run it.
It comes back and down on that side because it gets around. Yep. And this one should. Yep. There you go. There you go.
Oh, that makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
Now we can really see what we're doing. Yeah, this is going to make it a lot better to secure the wire to the wiring loom and really run this clean. This is the way to go. Get that vent tube out of the way. Now you can really see everything that we're doing. Now that we know the pathway for the wires, we're going to run them into the A-pillar pod. The hole we drilled is right here. Going to go in through there with one of them. Pull it through, and then I'm going to grab my other one. Same thing, go in through the back and pull it through. Now we got to plug these into the back to the max toe gauge, and they're different size connectors, so you really can't mess this up. So the bigger connector goes on the top, snap it in, and then the smaller one goes on the bottom. And then now I have to push this back through, take the slack back out with it, and then get this to where it's going to be reading properly. So kind of eyeball it to where it's going to be about where I want it, because it's pretty tight friction fit in here. Once I slide it in place, it might be hard to manipulate. So I'm going to force this sucker back in there. A little bit of a twisting motion and pushing back. I'll be able to get this sucker in there. Just like in usual Timmy the Toolman fashion, we're learning as we're going. I just notched out with the utility blade an area for the wires to sit in. So it was just a couple quick little cuts. This plastic's pretty soft, and so now the wires won't be stopping this A-pillar trim piece from sitting more flush. So there's a nice little channel now for the wires. Another thing that I'll mention now is, you see now I'm not using the plugs. I used 4 small screws instead of the plugs with some small nuts and washers on the back side. The reason why I did that is because the plugs weren't really holding it very well, and they stuck out the back enough to where they were hitting a little bit. I thought this would be better. It's a little, I guess you call it, industrial look. And this might not be for some of you. You might not like this look, but I painted it. I don't really care what it looks like. I think this is gonna hold the pod on better. I do think that these nuts do hit the A-pillar a little bit and stop it from fitting as flush as I would like, but this is what I came up with. ultimately, I think maybe the best choice is if you file down this edge. See how it sticks up a little bit? If you file down the edge a little bit to where this pod fit a little bit tighter to it, you can maybe put some type of glue or epoxy to just glue the pod onto the A-pillar trim piece instead of trying to screw it on like I did, or use those plastic plugs the kit comes with. Use whatever way you think is best. So now, and I'm pulling the wires from below as I'm working the A-pillar trim piece in position. If I keep a little tension on the wires down below, it'll help keep them in place in that channel I just created. Now I got to turn this thing to where it's going to look better when I'm looking at it. I think that looks good. What do you think, Mikey?
Yeah.
Look pretty good?
Yeah.
I think that's all she wrote. I'll go ahead and get the grab handle back in place.
No Loctite this time.
Yeah, no blue Loctite this time. It's not necessary. I'm going to now zip tie these two wires following the wiring loom. And this is not rocket science or anything we have to show great detail. You zip tie it however you feel necessary and just follow this natural wiring loom, zip tying it wherever you feel appropriate. One cool thing that Micah just showed me is this little plastic wire holder. You could just open it up with your hands and I could just tuck the wires through here and utilize it to hold the wires and then just pull like that. So it's just a nice little place to hang your wires so you don't have to use a zip tie. Pulling up information straight from the internet, I did a search for 1998 stereo wiring diagram, and it tells you that the constant 12 volt line is either a blue yellow or a blue black. The 12 volt switched is a gray wire, the ground wire is brown, and the illumination wire is green. The previous owner had an aftermarket stereo installed, and it actually makes it easier for us. But let's first show the wires that come from the stock harness. The blue yellow wire right here, this is the 12 volt constant. The gray wire is the 12 volt switched. The brown wire is your ground, and the green wire, that's the one for the illumination. And those are all the wires that we need to hook up the max toe gauge to. Now, when you follow backwards, what makes this so nice with this aftermarket wiring harness to wire the aftermarket stereo, these wires actually say what they're for. Matching up the new wiring harness for the new stereo to the factory wiring, the yellow one in this situation is the 12 volt constant. The red wire is the 12 volt switched. The black wire is going to be the ground. The illumination wire is going to be the orange. And like I said, they actually say right on the wire what they're for, so it takes the guesswork out of it.
So we've got the 4 wires down here at the end of the pigtail. And so what happens with this factory stereo wiring is they give these generic adapters like Tim was talking about. And the idea is that they're pigtails that somebody's gone through and taken, this is a stereo specific harness end. And they have used one of these, it's not a twist, it's a crimp, but it's like a pigtail style crimp connectors that they've used across all these wires. We're going to kind of repurpose this, and we've taken the 4 wires that we need. So this is the switched 12 volt, this is the ground, this is the constant 12 volt, and this is the illumination. And what we'll do is we're going to actually pop these ends off and free the wires up. And underneath, you can see here, this is the wiring coming from the new gauge. And so we're going to run this larger in on one side, and we're going to use new connectors. We'll talk about it in a minute, but basically we're going to run 2 into 1 like this. The 2 thinner gauge wires on one side with the thicker gauge on the other. So the easiest way to just deal with these is to just cut off the old ends, and we'll strip the wires and have some fresh copper showing. So I'm just taking these dikes and, well, shooting, and there you go. And so you have the 2 wires, which we will then use the wire strippers. This is probably an 18 gauge. Let's start with a 16 just in case, although I'm pretty sure it's an 18. And we want to give it about, I don't know, what is that, just over a 1/4 inch? And let's see. Before I do that. No, it's an 18 gauge. So we'll go to 18 on the tool. Again, these tools aren't ideal, but they do work. And you just want to thoroughly twist the insulation and then pull, and there you go. So there's a fresh. Now these stereo wires look, and man, these are 20 or 22. We'll go down to the 22 setting, and about the same. I guess that's just over a 1/4 inch. Yeah, look at that. It's even thinner than that. That's how you do it.
Okay, whatever.
Oh, and that's on film. Don't show my dad. He was an ex-dentist. According to the cheap wire strippers, this is actually less than 22 gauge or greater than, probably a 24 gauge, which is ridiculously small. And in fact, you'll see it's only on this red, which is again the switched 12, which this radio is probably only using as a sense signal. You'll see they are actually thicker for the other 3 wires, which are carrying more amperage through them. So we'll do the same. And once we've got them all cut off, then we'll be able to get the new wires run. Okay, and then we're going to go and strip these sides. Again, these are the 18 gauge setting. Again, probably you eyeball it, but it's about just over, what is that, about a 1/4 inch? And I'm from Canada, where we don't know what an inch is. So I'm just going to say this is about a 1/4 inch still. So there's one side ready to go, and we'll get the other side ready now. And again, these are thicker wires on this side, so probably you can see the wire. I mean, the insulation does mask it a bit, but they're roughly the same as the 18's gauge. So we'll try the 18 first and see if it catches. And really twist. Nope, see, that's not enough, so we'll go to the next. And you find some of the better crimp tools are like infinitely variable. Yeah, even this one's, see, it's coming, but not very well. There you go. Yeah, this illumination one is not a very large current draw, so they've used a different gauge on this one, which I may have to switch to the...
Switch to the tooth method?
Switch to the tooth method. Here.
Oh.
A little long. You can tell when you feel it on your tongue, you can tell approximately what a 1/4 inch is. And so I'm just twisting these edges just to keep them from unraveling. It's a big debate on the internet about the best way to do wire connections. Some people swear by just straight up soldering, heat shrink. Some people love the butt connectors for the speed. This is kind of the best of both worlds. What these are, and let me pull one of these out, is this is, I believe it's called a solder butt connector, and it does both. And so you can see here, it looks like a traditional butt connector, and you actually put the wires in on each side and crimp it down. But in the middle here, it's got solder. And so what happens is after you've crimped it, we're going to use the heat gun and we're going to shrink these ends. So these are heat shrink ends, which seals the wire. And they actually, I believe, have a glue in them as well, which keeps them sealed. And then we'll actually, after doing the ends, we're going to heat the middle. And this solder will actually melt and it spreads out and actually will solder and crimp the connection both at once. So these are apparently the best of all for connecting. And they're a little expensive, but Del City, again, delcity.net. These are 18 to 22 wire gauge is the red. The next is a blue, and it's a 14 to 16 gauge. And then finally for the big boys, you get these yellow ones, which I've used for doing big battery connections. And these are 10 to 12 wire gauge. And remember, we're doing 2 wires in on one side, and so you have to combine the wire gauge together. It's not just simply using, like if you have an 18 gauge that you're gonna, and you're putting 2 together, you don't just use a single 18 gauge one. These are probably 22 gauge, I'm gonna take a guess. This one plus the ones that came on the pod, those look like a 20 or 22. I think we should be fine using the red 18 gauge connectors here because that's an 18 on this side and it should work out quite nicely. So this is a tool, there's a lot of different ones out there. I believe there's probably a legit manufacturer that makes the original one, which is probably well in excess of $100, and the Chinese manufacturers have knocked these things off. So you can go on eBay and find these. And so this is like a crimping toolkit, but you got to check in and see kind of the uses that you're using for. Again, we're using heat shrink butt connectors, this A1 end, but you can see this comes with a bunch of different options here. The nice thing is they're color coded, and it actually has the wire gauge below and then the actual connector color here. So we're planning to use the red, the 18 to 22s, which is this dark red, and you can see you can even go down to an 8 on the other side. And so these come in and out, and they're interchangeable dies. So you'll see as we use them. Let's do the ground wire here. Ground wire is black. It's brown on the Toyota factory harness. This aftermarket radio stub is black. And so we're gonna push this in. You just hold it in there, bring the tool in, crimp down, like that. I'm gonna grab the other end, which is black here, and then Tim, you can confirm the gauge is also black for ground. Ground
yeah,
is
black. Black is vehicle engine ground.
Yep, so we're gonna pop that little end off. We're gonna bring these two up, and we're gonna twist them together. I like to have the insulation lined up. And if one's a little longer than the other, it's not a big problem, these butt connectors, because they actually will push the wire through into the other side, which is, I think, going to make a stronger connection. I'm going to take this, insert it in till the insulation is butted against the edge of the metal inside. Bring the crimp in, crimp it down. Then I'm going to take the heat gun. When you're doing the heat gun, you want to keep all the other wires away. It has a tendency to, especially with a small gauge wire, it melts through it very fast. Try not to put too much heat in the wires, but you kind of want these edges sealed up. And then, so now we're going to wait for the flash over on the solder. You can see it bubbling a little bit. I'll leave it for an extra second. Oh, there you go. So you've noticed that we've gone through and taped all the connectors afterwards. And what you'll find, and what we actually did find, is depending on the heat gun and how you're doing it, those heat guns get very hot. And some of the wiring, the insulation is not so heat proof. And you'll find that sometimes it bubbles, sometimes it melts right off. And so we've protected it by taping here, because we did see a little bit of bubbling on some of the ends of the insulation. And so just to make sure that it doesn't somehow, wear through and then start grounding out, it's just a little extra insurance.
All right, so reversing our procedure, we have to get this air tube back in that goes underneath the steering column.
And it's a little tricky, but what you want to do is you want to start with this side, because it tucks in and over top of the fuse box. So that looks pretty good like that. And then this comes in behind.
Yeah.
There you go. It's all lined up, and then you put the screw in.
Our air tube is back in. Now we got to get this sucker back in place. Just going to get all these 10mm bolts back in. These don't have to be super tight, just cinch them down snug, not a whole lot of force. Our gas hatch and our hood release hatch back in place. Slide it in through the back.
You'll notice on these there's a tab here that goes up and over top of the plastic. So you want to have it
right
exactly
there.
how Tim just did that. And sometimes you might need to open one of them. I think you have to pull the lever down and then drop it over. Yeah, exactly. And then you can bring it back and in.
There we go. Okay, we have the panel below the steering column back in place. We have our hood release and our fuel hatch release back in place. Now we're going to get the stereo back in. So hook up your antenna.
So this is actually, it's called the diversity antenna. And so the newer trucks will have, in the passenger side window, there's actually a second antenna. And so the factory radios will use both. They'll have both, but most aftermarket radios only have a single antenna port. So this extra one just sits unused, And so Tim's gonna zip tie it up.
So this was the source of an annoying rattle that I finally located. It was rattling as I was driving down the road and I couldn't figure out where it was. I finally pulled all this stuff out and noticed that this metal end was rubbing up against a metal part of the frame behind the stereo, and that's what was the source of my rattle. So I'm gonna make sure I zip tie this thing up to where it can't rattle up against anything. Now we could push this whole thing back in place. These are an 8mm bolt. These don't need to be that tight either. It's just holding the stereo in, so don't over tighten and strip these small little bolts. Now we got to get this faceplate back in place. So getting this thing in, it came out this way, so I'm going to slide it around the shifter and then swivel it in place. And there's a couple things we got to get connected here. So you have this light for the ashtray, and then you have the power and light for the cigarette lighter. So you got to make sure those are in the right spot. The ashtray bulb just kind of pushes in. It's a friction fit. Just push it in place. The other two connectors are right here, and these just snap in place. This other one on the far left just slides on, it doesn't snap. Okay, those are connected. Now we can tilt this in. We have 3 connectors over here that we have to hook up. There's a slimmer connector, and that one goes below the 2 on the top. So snap that one in. And then the 2 on the top are different sizes. You can't mix them up. So the smaller one goes on the left, and the bigger one goes on the right as I'm staring at the instrument panel. Now you can slide this back in place, and it should snap in like so. Now remember, there was 2 screws that hold this faceplate to the heater control. There's one on the top left, and then there's one on the bottom right. Snap our heater control faceplate back in place like so. We can get our AC switch, which just pops right in. Just push it in until it's all the way seated. We have our heater control knobs. These again just slide right on. And then we have the other 2 control knobs. That's all secure. We can get our shifter cover back on, slide it over the transmission shifter. The first thing we're going to do, if you have a limited, is we're going to reconnect the electrical connection for the push button 4-wheel drive. Push it in, pull back, make sure it's secure. And then the 4-wheel drive shifter slides down, so this will snap in place. We're going to get the small screw that also had Loctite on it. I wouldn't suggest putting Loctite on it again, and just screw it in snug. It doesn't have to be super tight. Okay, now we're going to get our parking brake cover back in place and get the electrical connectors plugged back in. Plug that in, and then there's 2 on this side. You have the little light for the alarm, and it goes into the bottom part, snaps in place, and then you have the little speaker, and that goes up above it and snaps in place. And then you have, finally, for the rear window, you snap that in place. Now all the electrical connectors are attached, and then we can snap this back down. Get the armrest out of the way. There we go. Put your stereo back in so you can listen to some tunes. At the beginning of the video, I talked about all the parts that I bought to tee into the transmission cooler line. So I used some Teflon paste. You could use Teflon tape, and I just tighten these up into the fitting. You can hold on to this with like a crescent wrench, or you can put it in a vise. I use a 9/16 open-end wrench, and I tighten these 2 3/8 barbs into the side of the T. Then I put Teflon paste on the bushing, and I also put Teflon paste on the male threads of the sending unit, and then I tighten that in place. And this ended up being closer to a 14mm, and I just put it in the vise and tighten it in place. So now we have to cut this in to the send line. This line that goes to the passenger side of the transmission cooler is the send line. The hot fluid goes in to the cooler here, it travels through the cooler, it leaves the cooler, and then it goes back to the transmission. On my vehicle, I actually have the fluid going into a magnetic filter which travels up to an external cooler, and then from the external cooler it comes back to the transmission. So that's an optional thing that you can do if you want some additional cooling. If you drive up in the mountains or you tow, I highly recommend an aftermarket transmission cooler to keep your temps lower. So I already put a mark of where I'm going to make my first cut, and because the hose is going to go to here and here, I might have to cut out a section of hose so the transmission send line isn't kinked. So I'm going to make my first cut here and then see where we're at. This right here, this is for PVC pipe, and I found out it works really well for cutting hose. So it makes nice straight cuts instead of using a utility blade. So I just get it in the spot where I want it and I start ratcheting this thing down. I'm going to slide a hose clamp on first, then get this in place, and then see if I can make this work without having to cut any off. It looks like I'm going to have to cut some off. So just eyeballing it, taking a measurement, it looks like I'll cut off about right there. So once you get it on there with the hose clamps, turn the fitting in the direction where you're going to be running the line. So I'm going to be actually traveling up this cooler line that goes to the external cooler that I added. So I'm just going to turn it in that direction and then secure the hose clamps. Now it looks good right there. All right, those are securely in place. I also put a little abrasion protection, an extra section of hose in between the two hoses, and then I'm just zip tying them together so they don't move around a lot.
So you can see the provided cable length has only allowed us to get halfway down the passenger side front fender, and we still have probably another 2-3 feet to go. So what we're going to do is we like these factory barrel ends and don't really want to have to go source some other ones and crimp them. So what we're going to do is we're going to splice another length of wire in here. It's all going to be inside the sheathing anyways, so I don't think it's going to be a big deal, but we'll cut back a little ways here where it'll be easier for us to splice up top here than out of the truck, and then we'll bring this piece down and we'll run an extra length of wire in there. Moment of truth. So now we're going to go and we're going to strip off this over cover, and then we'll do the same as we did inside, where we're going to strip the interior wires. You can see there's a black and a white in each there, and so we're going to use similar butt connectors. This is very small. This is actually 24 wire gauge, 24 AWG, which is about as small as those little butt crimp connectors will go. So I'm going to peel the outer sheathing off. This is too big to fit in the wire strippers that we're using, so I'm going to go back a little ways. Let's call it back here with just over an inch and a bit, and we're just going to use the utility knife and just gently roll. You don't want to cut into the inner wire, so I'm just rolling to cut through this outer sheathing. Try and keep it in a straight line, and you can bend it back and forth to see where you've cut and where you've missed. It helps to have a nice sharp utility knife like this. You don't want to go too far in, obviously. You're going to nick the inner wires, and as you do this, it's kind of, I don't know, work hardening the plastic, and you can see where at some point you're just going to twist and it's just going to pop right off. And this stuff appears that this was probably manufactured around it rather than slid over top, so it's going to take some force to pull it off. There you go. So you can see the two wires underneath. And we're going to do the same on this other end, and then we're going to go and try and find some 24 gauge wire, though I don't think we're going to find that, but something similar gauge that we can use for splice.
Okay, the wiring for the temperature sending unit runs along the firewall. It's in this black wire sheath, and then I just tucked it in behind a bunch of different things. It goes around, goes behind the cruise control, it goes around the air box, it drops down, it attaches to the cooler line that runs to my external transmission cooler, and then it goes down to the sending unit. Like I said, it runs along one of the cooler lines, and then it connects up and T's in right here. What we did is that we used the factory connectors down here that plug in with the max toe gauge, and then we spliced in a section in the engine bay basically, so we have 2 splices to get the line right, because the length of line that they provided isn't long enough to do the route that we chose through the firewall, through the engine bay, and then down through the front here. So we had to add some wire that Mikey had to make it work. This wiring loom going through the firewall grommet is potentially a pathway for moisture. I guess you can do electrical tape. I'm just going to choose to use a little silicone, and this might be temporary because I might be adding some additional wiring in the future. So I just have this big clear RTV silicone can, and I'm going to see if I could just squeeze some on all sides and seal it up. Getting it on the other side is going to be the hard part. Yeah, it's just going to have to be the finger trick. Smear it on with the fingers. The silicone is going to seal that connection of the wiring loom going through the firewall grommet, so no moisture can get in. Say if I was, going through some deep puddles or something and water splashed up, there's no way water is going to get in through that entryway now. Okay, here's the moment of truth. I'm going to turn the key on. The thing's doing this weird startup procedure. Now I'm going to turn it on. And the transmission is cold right now, so I'm going to have to take it for a drive to see if it actually works. Right now it's not registering hardly anything because the transmission is really cold. It's only registering 80, but after I drive it for a while and heat up the transmission, I should see the temp go into the area about 120 to 140. If I start climbing hills or start driving for longer, then I'll see it get up even higher into an operating range closer to like 160, 170. We notice on this gauge that on the low end on the digital readout is 80, and until it got above 80, it wouldn't register anything. So when we first started driving, we were wondering like, man, is this thing gonna work? But then finally it started moving. So right now, the digital and the analog gauge are showing right about 103. The dimming feature works too. So I'm gonna turn the headlights on, and it dimmed, and then turn them back off. It actually works as advertised. One of the last things you should do is get underneath the vehicle and recheck those hose clamps where you put that T into the send line. Make sure that those connections are leak free. You saw that I lost just a tiny bit of transmission fluid, so I just added a tiny bit to the transmission dipstick tube. There's really no need for me to recheck the level because I know I added back about the same amount I lost, so I should be good to go. All right, we're done with this job. We showed you how to install an aftermarket transmission temperature gauge in either your 96, 97, or 98 4Runner. If you have a 99 through 2002 third generation 4Runner, you don't have to worry about adding an aftermarket gauge because you can get the transmission temperature information right from the OBDII reader that's taking information from the ECU. This again is just for 96 to 98 vehicles that don't offer that information, and you can't get it through the OBDII port. You obviously have options with this job of where you install the aftermarket gauge, whether you follow my lead and put it on the A-pillar. Some people put it, like I said, right near the shifters. They cut a hole in the plastic trim piece that goes around the shifters and they put it right there. I don't really like that one because that means you have to avert your eyes downward and not pay attention to the road. With the A-pillar one, it's right there in your field of view. You don't have to really take your eyes off the road to see it. You also have your choice of meter. I chose the max toe gauge for 2 reasons. One, because it has more increments on the analog dial, and it has a digital readout where the autometer ones didn't offer that. I think it's, in my opinion, a superior gauge than the autometer, but maybe I'll live to regret that statement. Maybe it'll fail on me, but for right now, I'm pretty happy with the max toe gauge. So, thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. If you have any questions or comment, do that below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Take care. Bye-bye.